Will you marry me? 6 months ago, Randy stepped off a military transport onto American soil, carrying a duffel bag and a 6-year-old boy. Now, the woman next door was asking him to be a husband. He had no idea what to say. The neighborhood was the kind of quiet that felt earned wide lawns, slow mailman sprinklers going off at the same time every morning, like everyone had agreed on it years ago. People here had lived beside each other for decades without ever needing to know each other's last names. Randy moved in on a Thursday in October, 2 months after he came home from his third tour overseas. He didn't bring much. A duffel bag, a toolbox, and a boy who carried nothing at all. The house was a rental 2 bedrooms off Callaway Street, a leaky faucet, a back door that wouldn't close right. Randy fixed both within the first week. After that, he kept finding other things to fix: the loose step on the porch, the cracked gutter along the east side, the kitchen cabinet that swung too wide and hit the wall. He worked with a steadiness that had nothing to do with urgency. It was just the only way he knew how to be still. The neighbors noticed him the way people notice something they don't have a ready word for. A black man alone with a brown-skinned boy who didn't look like him in a neighborhood where most people looked like each other. Nobody said anything directly. But curtains moved. The woman across the street. Carol, somewhere in her 60s with a voice built for church committees, was the most consistent. She wasn't cruel about it. She just happened to be at her window every time Randy pulled out of the driveway. Every time he walked Elijah to the end of the driveway to catch the school bus. Every time he hauled firewood from the back of his truck or dragged the trash can to the curb. Just happening to notice, happening to be there. Randy was used to being watched. He'd been watched his whole life, first through the institutional windows of group homes, then through the lens of expectation in uniform. The watching itself had never been the hard part. What came after it was harder: the conclusions people reached without asking the questions shaped to sound like concern. Inside the house, he kept things orderly in a way that felt less like habit and more like control. No photographs on the walls, no decorations on the shelves, just a couch, a lamp, and one chair pulled close to the living room window that faced the backyard, and that was where Randy went every morning before anything else started. Coffee in hand, no phone. Just whatever the yard looked like at 6 in the morning. It was usually gray and quiet and asked nothing from him, and he found that useful. Elijah had the second bedroom. Randy had painted it soft yellow because the boy had pointed at a crayon, that color at the hardware store, held it up. Looked at it, set it back, and that had been enough of a signal. There was a low shelf, a mattress close to the floor after Elijah had moved it off the frame himself during the second week, and above the small desk, a drawing taped to the wall. 3 figures, one tall, one shorter, one standing just outside a fence slightly apart from the other 2. Elijah had drawn it in the first week. He hadn't explained it. Randy hadn't asked. The boy was 6 years old with a quietness that went deeper than shyness. He had picked up English faster than anyone expected, faster than the caseworker had thought possible, but he used it selectively as if words were something he didn't want to spend carelessly. He watched everything around him, not with anxiety, with the attention of someone who had understood early that paying attention was worth more than reacting. What he loved was drawing. He drew on the backs of grocery receipts, on the margins of his school papers, in the notebooks Randy kept buying him without comment. He never labeled anything, never explained. But if you sat with his drawings long enough, they told a story. The woman next door had been looking for a while. Diana had moved to Callaway Street 3 years earlier after the end of a marriage she didn't discuss in detail. She taught second grade at the elementary school 4 blocks away, left early every morning, and came home each afternoon with chalk dust on her sleeves and a patience that felt either deeply genuine or very well practiced. Randy hadn't been able to tell the difference, and he wasn't sure it mattered. She had started small, a casserole dish left on the porch with a sticky note. Too much for one person. A wave across the yard in the mornings when their schedules crossed. One afternoon, when Elijah had been standing in the rain, waiting for Randy to unlock the front door, Diana had walked over and held her umbrella over the boy, without turning it into anything, just stood there until the door opened, then kept walking. Elijah remembered that. Randy had seen it from the window and filed it somewhere he hadn't yet decided what to do with. At night, her house was always lit, not every room at once, just the ones she moved through. From his chair, Randy could trace the shape of her evenings by the lights. Kitchen first, then the living room, then the back bedroom, always last. It was the only place on that street that looked like someone was actually home. He told himself he didn't think about it much. He was wrong about that. The morning Diana asked her question was a Tuesday in March, the kind of morning that couldn't settle drizzle coming and going, the sky the flat gray of old concrete. Randy was crouched in the driveway with Elijah's foot in his hand, working the laces through the eyelets of the boy's sneakers. He'd watched the tutorial the night before, the kind made for kids, a calm voice walking through every step, and he still got the bows slightly uneven. Elijah looked down at them each time without complaint and accepted them as they were. Diana came down the sidewalk at her usual pace, umbrella open bag over her shoulder. She would have passed right by if she hadn't stopped. Randy looked up. She stood there for a moment, looking at the two of them in the driveway, the man on one knee in the wet concrete, the boy standing, patient as a post, and then she said it. "Will you marry me?" Randy stayed where he was, lace still in hand. He waited to see if more was coming. "I'm not joking," Diana said. "I've been thinking about it for a while." Elijah looked at her, then at Randy. His face stayed even. Randy stood slowly. "You've been thinking about asking me to marry you. The two of you are struggling," she said, not with pity, just observation. "I live alone. I have more than I need. I think we could help each other." It wasn't the kind of proposal built for telling later. No candles, no emotion dressed up as performance. Just a woman on a damp sidewalk talking straight before the day had properly started. And maybe because of that, because it had nothing extra attached to it, it was harder to brush off than something adorned would have been. "I need to think about it," Randy said. Diana nodded the way someone nods when they've already allowed for that answer. She adjusted her umbrella and kept walking, no hesitation, no second glance, as if she'd suggested splitting a grocery run and didn't need a response right away. Elijah watched her until she rounded the corner. Then he looked at Randy. Randy looked back at his son and found he had nothing useful to say. The bus came and went. He stood in the driveway afterward with the drizzle settling on his jacket and the umbrella still folded in his hand. That afternoon, Carol found a reason to cross the street. She knocked on Diana's door with a container of leftover soup, but it was her expression that carried the real purpose of the visit. "I saw you two this morning," Carol said before Diana had fully stepped aside. Diana accepted the container. "That was kind of you." Carol lowered her voice in the way people do when they want what they're saying to sound like a favor. "I just think someone should ask, do you actually know what you'd be getting into? With him? With that boy?" Diana looked at her neighbor with a steadiness that left no gap to step through. "Thank you for looking out, Carol." She closed the door. Carol stood on the porch a moment, container gone, question unanswered, and walked back across the street. That night, Randy sat in his chair and watched the dark yard and did not sleep. He kept returning to the way Diana had said it. Not "I think we'd be good together" or "I've been feeling something," the kinds of things people said when they wanted to leave themselves a way out. She'd said, "Marry me plain and level the way people speak," when they mean exactly what they're saying and nothing more. He'd spent most of his adult life building situations he could manage. 3 tours had trained him to read a room, calculate what was coming, stay ahead of it. He had gotten good at it. And then he came home and there was a 6-year-old who needed someone to tie his shoes, and he was watching a tutorial made for preschoolers at 11 at night, and now the woman next door wanted to be his wife. He didn't know what to do with any of it. What he kept coming back to was Elijah's face that morning. The boy hadn't looked startled, hadn't looked confused. He had looked at Diana and then at Randy, The way he looked at a half-finished drawing like he already knew what it was going to become, like he was simply waiting for the last lines to be drawn. The next morning, before Randy was out of bed, the front door opened. Soft, careful. He pulled himself up and looked through the window. Elijah was on the porch in his pajamas holding a piece of paper. He walked to Diana's door, set the paper flat on her welcome mat, and came back inside. He hadn't knocked. Randy put on his jacket and went to look. The drawing showed 3 figures, the same 3 from the wall above Elijah's desk, one tall, one shorter, one standing outside a fence, except this time the fence had a small door cut into it, and the door was open. Randy stood on the cold porch holding the drawing in both hands for a long time. Then he folded it carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, and went back inside. An hour later, he knocked on Diana's door. She answered with her coffee without much surprise on her face. She had already seen the drawing when she left for school. "I'll do it," Randy said. He kept his voice level. "But I need you to understand something. I don't know how to be in a family. I never had one growing up. I'm going to get things wrong probably more than once." Diana looked at him steadily. "So will I." He thought about that. It was, he realized, the most honest answer anyone had given him in a very long time. "Then we figure it out as we go," he said. He didn't extend his hand. She didn't reach for anything. They stood in her doorway in the gray morning, 2 people who had each lost more than they talked about agreeing to try something neither of them had any real preparation for. When Randy came home, Elijah was at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal and a paper bag he was drawing on with his free hand. He looked up. Randy sat down across from him. "She's going to come stay with us." Elijah looked at his bowl for a moment. Then he nodded, once the nod he gave to things he already knew. That evening he went to his room, took out a fresh sheet of paper, and drew 3 figures standing under the same roof. The tall one, the shorter one, and a woman near the door, not leaving, just arrived. Diana moved in on a Saturday with 1 rolling suitcase and 4 boxes of books. She didn't bring curtains or throw pillows or anything that would announce she was redecorating. She took the second closet in the hallway and put her books on the empty shelf in the living room, and that was mostly it. They didn't use the word married. They didn't use the word family. They were 2 people who had agreed to share a roof and figure out the rest, and for the first 3 weeks they treated each other with the careful courtesy of strangers who didn't want to take up too much space. Diana cooked in the evenings, not elaborate things, just real food, the kind that made the kitchen smell occupied. Randy fixed whatever was wrong with the house, which was more than he had originally thought. Elijah moved between them, both quiet as ever, watching with the patience of someone waiting for a picture to come into focus. There were small things that were harder than they should have been. Diana rearranged the kitchen one afternoon. Nothing dramatic, just moved the mugs to a lower cabinet and the cutting boards to the drawer by the stove. She hadn't mentioned it. Randy came in for water that night, reached for where the mugs had been, and found empty shelf. He didn't say anything. But he lay awake longer than usual, and in the morning he was at the kitchen table before the coffee finished brewing, working through something in his head that he wasn't ready to name. Then there was the afternoon Diana dropped an entire bag of flour. It went everywhere, the counter, the floor, her hair, the front of her shirt. She stood there looking at herself, and then started laughing, the helpless kind that doesn't need an audience. Elijah, sitting at the table with a juice box, looked up and laughed, too sudden and unguarded, the laugh of a child who has decided something is safe. Randy was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. He watched his son's face, that undefended expression, and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was clenched. The feeling surprised him so much that it immediately frightened him. He went back to the garage. The thing about Diana was that she asked small questions. Not the large ones people usually wanted to ask Randy, the ones about where he'd been, what he'd seen, whether he was doing all right, whether Elijah was adjusting. She asked things like, "How many sugars do you take in your coffee? And do you want the last of this, or should I save it?" They were nothing questions, negligible questions, the kind that filled space without demanding anything. But Randy had never had anyone ask about his preferences before, not about the small things, not about him separate from his circumstances. He found himself answering carefully like a man who'd been handed something fragile and wasn't sure of his grip. 3 weeks in, the call came from the county. A woman at the Department of Children and Family Services introduced herself and said a concern had been reported regarding the welfare of a minor in his home. She was courteous and gave nothing away. A home visit would be scheduled. Randy knew who had made the call. He didn't say it out loud. Sandra Hayes arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, a woman in her 50s carrying a clipboard and a weathered professionalism that had seen too many homes to be moved easily by any single one. She walked through the kitchen, the living room, Elijah's room. She looked at the drawings on the wall without comment. She looked at Randy the same way. When she sat down at the kitchen table and asked him to describe his household arrangement, Randy said, "We're friends." From the kitchen, without turning around, Diana said, "We're husband and wife." Sandra wrote something down. Randy looked toward the kitchen, and Diana turned just enough to meet his eyes. She wasn't apologizing. Sandra told them there would be a formal evaluation in 30 days. She would need to assess stability, routine, the child's adjustment, and the nature of the relationships in the home. If the home did not meet the standard required for legal guardianship, the county would have to consider alternative arrangements for Elijah on a temporary basis while the case was reviewed. After she left, Randy stood at the kitchen sink washing the coffee mugs she had used. Diana came to the doorway. "I should have asked you first. I'm sorry." Randy set a mug down on the drying rack. He stood still for a moment with his hands on the edge of the sink. "No," he said. "Thank you." Then he picked up the next mug. Diana came in and picked up a dish towel, and they finished in silence, the kind that had started quietly to feel less like distance and more like company. Elijah came home from school on a Thursday and walked straight past the kitchen without stopping, which was not what he usually did. He went to his room, closed the door most of the way, and sat at his desk with his notebook open and his pencil in his hand. He didn't draw anything. He just sat there. Randy had been in the garage when the bus came. He noticed the closed door, finished wiping down his hands, and came to stand in the hallway. He watched through the gap, the boy, the blank page, the pencil, not moving. He knocked on the door frame and went in. He pulled the small chair out from beside the desk and sat down. "How was school today?" Elijah looked at the blank page. Randy tried again. "Did something happen?" Nothing. He stayed in the room for a while longer, not pushing, not filling the space with more words, just present. But it wasn't enough, and he knew it. He could feel the inadequacy of it, the way you feel a tool slipping in your hand, doing exactly what it's supposed to, and still not reaching the thing you need. He went to the kitchen and stood at the counter and tried to think of what a person did in this situation. What a father did. He didn't have a model to work from. Nobody had ever sat in a chair beside him and waited. Diana came home 40 minutes later with her bag over her shoulder and chalk dust on her right sleeve the way she usually did. She saw Randy at the counter and read the house in less time than it took to set down her bag. She didn't ask what had happened. She just went to the table, sat down, and pulled a notepad from the stack near the fruit bowl. She took a pen and drew a house. Simple. 4 lines and a triangle on top. The kind of house a child draws first when they're learning what a house is supposed to look like. Then she pushed the notepad down the table toward the hallway. Elijah appeared in the doorway. He looked at the notepad, then at Diana. He came to the table and sat down. Diana slid the pen toward him. He looked at the blank house for a long time. Then he picked up the pen. He drew 3 people inside, simple figures placed with intention, one near the back wall, one near the window, one near the door. A house that held people without crowding them. Diana looked at the drawing. "Who is this?" Elijah pointed to each figure in turn. Dad! Miss Diana! He touched the last one. Me! Randy was at the kitchen doorway. He didn't go in. He stood with one hand against the frame and watched his son name the people in a house that was also apparently theirs. The back of his throat tightened. He turned toward the wall, pressing his forehead lightly against the doorframe. Outside the window above the sink, the yard was going dark, the last light going gray at the edges of the fence. He stood there and kept his breathing even, but his eyes were wet. That was just what they were doing. After a while, Elijah reached under the table and picked up his sketchbook, the first one Randy had bought him the cover, soft from handling. He opened it to the first page and slid it across the table to Diana. She looked at it. The drawing on the first page was older, the lines more tentative, the proportions unsteady in the way of a child just beginning to make sense of the page. But the image was clear. A large figure, bent low arms out, reaching toward a small figure standing alone, and beside the large figure slightly apart, a second adult one hand placed flat against their chest, as if something had caught there. "That's Dad," Elijah said, pointing to the bent figure. Diana nodded. He pointed to the figure with the hand on its chest. "That's you. I drew this the first week we were here, before you moved in." The room was quiet. "I knew you were going to come," Elijah said, not with any drama, just the way he said most things, plainly because the fact was simply a fact to him. Diana sat with the sketchbook open in front of her and did not speak for a moment. She looked at the drawing and then at the boy, and something in her face opened the way a room opens when a window is finally unlatched. She said quietly, more to herself than to anyone, "I used to think a family needed to look a certain way to be real." Elijah looked at her. "Someone told me that once," she said, "when I wasn't enough on my own to make one." She smoothed the edge of the sketchbook page with her thumb. "He was wrong." She didn't say anything else about it. She didn't need to. But the sentence stayed in the room the first time she had offered something of herself without being asked, and both Randy and the boy received it without pressing for more. Randy, still at the doorframe, looked down at his hands. The calluses along his palms were from years of work ropes, tools, concrete steel. He had earned every one of them doing things he believed needed doing. He had crossed oceans and come home. He had learned to tie shoes from a video made for toddlers. He had painted a room yellow because a small child had pointed at a crayon. And this child, this boy who had learned too early that asking didn't guarantee an answer, had drawn him into a home before they'd even moved into one together, had drawn a woman into that home beside him before she'd ever knocked on their door. Randy pushed back from the door frame and walked quietly down the hallway. He went to the back door, stood with his hand flat against the wood, and looked at the dark yard. He stayed there until his hands were steady again. Then he went back to the kitchen and put a pot of water on the stove because dinner still needed to happen, and that was a thing he knew how to do. The warmth of that evening did not carry forward the way Randy had hoped it might. It wasn't that he decided to pull back. There was no decision. It was more like weather arriving, gradually settling in without announcement. One morning he skipped the chair by the window. The next he worked until close to midnight, came in after Diana and Elijah were already asleep, and ate a cold plate standing at the counter. The dinner had been left covered on the stove. He washed the dish when he was done and left it on the drying rack and went to bed without turning on any lights. He told himself he was busy. There was always something to fix. But what was true, and what he couldn't bring himself to sit with, was that the evening with the sketchbook had gotten too close to something, and getting close to something was how you set yourself up to lose it. That was the pattern he had lived by for as long as he could remember, not because anyone had taught it to him in words, but because the evidence had accumulated quietly across his whole life that good things were borrowed, not owned. That warmth was the thing right before the cold. Diana noticed. Of course she noticed. She was a woman who read second graders for a living 8-year-olds who couldn't tell you what was wrong, but whose whole bodies broadcast it. Randy didn't stand a chance. She didn't say anything for almost 2 weeks. She kept the mornings steady, kept dinner on the stove, kept her presence undemanding. But there were small signals. She stopped asking about his coffee. She stopped moving through the kitchen with the ease that had been building. She became more careful, more exact, the same way a person moves when they're no longer sure they're welcome somewhere. One evening after Elijah was in bed, she knocked on the open door of the garage where Randy was working. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked. He looked up from the workbench. "No." "Then I need you to stop treating me like I'm already gone." Randy set down what he was holding. He tried to find the right thing to say, some explanation that was honest without being the kind of honest that made everything worse. But the real answer was that he didn't know how to do this differently. He had never stayed put long enough in anything to develop another way. Diana looked at him across the garage. The tools hung in rows on the wall behind him, everything in its place, everything controlled. "I'm not here because I ran out of options," she said. "I'm here because I decided to be here, and I can decide differently." Her voice didn't waver. It wasn't an ultimatum dressed as calm. It was just the truth stated plainly. "But I can't do this if you're going to spend every good moment waiting for it to end." She went back inside. Randy stayed in the garage for a long time after that, sitting on the stool with his hands in his lap and nothing in them. The letter from the county arrived that same week. Formal language county letterhead. The evaluation with Sandra Hayes would proceed as scheduled. The letter also noted that additional information had been submitted by a community member raising concerns about the household environment and the primary guardian's suitability. If the evaluation resulted in an unsatisfactory determination, the county would initiate temporary alternative placement proceedings for the minor child while the case was under review. Randy read the letter twice. Then he folded it and put it in the drawer under the workbench with the other paperwork. He didn't tell Diana about it. He told himself it was because he didn't want to worry her. But the real reason, if he'd been honest enough to find it, was that the letter had confirmed something the voice in the back of his head had been saying all along, that the ground he was standing on had never been his, that the people who had the authority to decide what happened to Elijah would look at him and see exactly what had been reported to Sandra Hayes, a man who wasn't stable. He started sleeping less, started checking the locks twice before bed, started recalculating the way he used to calculate exit routes, figuring out before anything happened who was at risk and from what and how to reduce the damage. He didn't see yet that the damage he was calculating for was already being caused by him, quietly, every day. The night before Sandra Hayes was scheduled to arrive, Randy was still awake at midnight when he heard Diana's voice from the other end of the hallway, low, not carrying the kind of volume people use when they don't want to be overheard. He wasn't trying to listen. He was going to the kitchen for water. But the words reached him anyway in pieces. "I don't know how much longer I can do this. I understand why he is the way he is, I do. But I can't live in a house where someone looks at me every day like I'm about to disappoint them." He stopped where he was in the dark hallway. "I'm not asking him to be fixed. I'm just asking him to let me in, and he won't." He went back to his room. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with the room dark around him. He thought about the letter in the garage. He thought about Sandra's clipboard and the county's language about alternative placement and suitability. He thought about the way Diana had become more careful, more contained, because he had made her feel like she had to be. He thought the most honest thing I can do is step back. The logic of it felt clean in the way that wrong things sometimes do when you've been awake too long. Diana deserved a real choice, not the one she'd made when she didn't know yet what staying would actually cost her. And the evaluation tomorrow would go better, he told himself, if the household dynamics weren't complicated by something that wasn't working. He took a notepad from the nightstand and wrote one sentence I think Diana should have room to make her own choice without me standing in the way. He left it on the kitchen table. Then he took his keys, went out to his truck, and sat in the dark driveway with the engine off. He told himself he would go back inside after an hour. He stayed until nearly 3 in the morning. Diana found the note when she came out for water. She stood at the kitchen table in the low light and read it. She read it again. Then she looked up at the wall across from the table. Elijah had taped one of his drawings there the previous week, the 3-person house, the one with all of them under the same roof. It was still there, undisturbed, right where the boy had decided it belonged. She looked at that drawing for a while. Then she went to the guest closet and got her suitcase. She moved carefully, quietly, folding things and setting them in the bag with the deliberateness of someone who is making sure every action is intentional. She was not running. She had been a woman who made decisions with both eyes open her entire adult life, and she was making one now. She could not stay in a house where the man inside did not believe he was allowed to be there. She had learned the hard way what it felt like to be in a space where someone else had already decided the ending. She left her books on the shelf. Before she walked out, she went to Elijah's door, still closed, the boy asleep, and slipped a small piece of paper underneath it. Just a name and an address. No explanation. She knew Elijah would understand. He always understood. Then she left. The house was quiet behind her. Elijah woke at his usual time, 6:15, the way he always did. He found the paper on the floor just inside his door. He read it, folded it once, and held it in his hand when he came out to the hallway. He turned toward Diana's room out of habit. The door was open. The bed was folded back into the shape of an unoccupied room. Her shoes, which she usually left by the door, were gone. He didn't call out. He didn't go looking. He went back to his own room, and when Randy came in from outside 20 minutes later, he found Elijah standing at the wall above his desk. Elijah was taking down the drawing, the one with the 3 figures he'd put up the first week. He took it down, carefully smoothed the tape marks, folded the paper in half and in half again, and opened the top drawer of his desk and set it inside. He closed the drawer. Then he sat down at the desk with a blank piece of paper and didn't reach for a pencil. Randy stood in the doorway and watched all of it. He thought about the boy on the train, silent, dry-eyed, staring forward, as if he'd already learned that making noise didn't bring people back. He thought, I taught him that. Not with words, not with any intention. But he had come home from a war and built an orderly, defended, half-empty life, and a 6-year-old had been watching all of it and learning. He had taught Elijah exactly what he did not want him to know. Randy sat on the front porch step with his hands around a mug that had gone cold. The morning was clear and still. The street hadn't woken up yet. No sprinklers, no car doors, just birds moving through the trees along the fence line. It was the kind of quiet he used to want. Now it sat on him like weight. He kept returning to moments he thought he'd gotten past. The afternoon, Elijah reached up and took his hand in the cereal aisle of the grocery store, small fingers threading between his without warning, and Randy had let his hand go loose instead of closing around it because closing around it meant it could be taken away. The evening at the kitchen table when Diana had laughed at something Elijah said, and Randy had felt the table and the light and the whole ordinary fact of the moment as something almost unbearable in its goodness, and had found a reason to leave the room. Every time he had stood at the edge of something real and chosen the doorway instead. He had crossed oceans. He had carried a child home. He had learned to tie shoes from a video and painted a room yellow from one gesture. He had done all of that. And then when it counted, he had written a sentence on a notepad and sat in his truck in the dark and told himself it was the generous thing to do. The door behind him opened. Elijah came out in his socks, which he knew he wasn't supposed to wear outside. He sat down on the step beside Randy without asking if that was all right. They sat there together for a while, looking at the empty street. Then Elijah said, "Do you know why I don't cry?" Randy looked at him. "Because you don't," Elijah said. He said it simply not as accusation, just as information, the way he reported most things he had observed. "I learned from you." Randy didn't say anything. "But I want to cry," Elijah continued. His voice stayed even. "I want Miss Diana to be here." Randy set the cold mug down on the step beside him. "I know," he said. They sat without speaking for another stretch. A car turned onto the far end of Calloway Street and moved slowly past. Elijah watched it until it was gone. "Are you?" Elijah asked. Randy looked at his son, the steady dark eyes, the set of his jaw, the patience that no 6-year-old should have had to practice as much as this one had. "Am I what? Do you want her here?" Randy held the question for a moment. He had become very good at holding questions until the feeling behind them passed. But he was sitting on a cold porch step beside a child who had put his drawing in a drawer instead of on the wall, and the feeling was not passing. He nodded. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration. It was a single movement of his head, and it cost him something, not because it wasn't true, but because he had spent so long pretending it wasn't. Elijah looked at him for a moment longer. Then he reached into his pajama pocket and held out the small folded paper Diana had slipped under his door. "She left this for me," he said, "in case you needed it." Randy took the paper. He opened it. A name, an address. 12 minutes away. He looked at his son. Elijah stood up, brushed off the back of his pajamas, and went inside, leaving the door open behind him. The address led to a narrow 2-story near the edge of the school district. Randy sat in the truck outside for a moment before going up. Diana answered the door, still in the clothes she'd arrived in. She looked at him without surprise. She stepped aside and he came as far as the entryway and stopped. He didn't know where to start, so he started at the beginning, the real beginning. He told her about growing up in the foster system, about moving between homes often enough that he'd stopped unpacking his bag all the way, because packing again was easier if you'd never really settled. About how he'd gone into the military, partly because it was the first institution that had wanted him without reservation, and how even there he'd made sure never to need anyone more than they needed him, because needing someone was how you ended up standing in a hallway watching their door close. He told her that the evening Elijah had shown her the sketchbook had been the closest Randy had come to something he wanted to call home, and that the wanting of it had frightened him so badly he'd spent the following weeks methodically taking it apart. "I wrote that note because I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "I told myself you deserved a real choice. But the truth is, I was just doing what I've always done, leaving before I could be left." Diana stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms at her sides. "I know why you do it," she said. "I understood that before I knocked on your door. I know you did." "That's not the same as being able to live with it," she said. "No," Randy said. "It's not." He kept his eyes on her. "Elijah told me this morning that he doesn't cry because I don't, that he learned it from watching me." Diana's expression shifted. "I don't want him to carry that," Randy said, "and I don't want to keep being the reason he has to." He took a breath. "I can't promise I'll get this right. I have too much evidence against myself to promise that. But I need you to know that I don't want you to go. Not because of what you do for us, because of what it feels like when you're there. And I have never said that to another person in my life." The room stayed quiet. Diana looked at him the way she had that morning in the rain, straight clear without anything decorating it. "Do you believe you deserve to be happy?" she asked. He thought about it, not the way he used to dismiss questions reflexively with a redirect, but actually thought about it there in someone else's entryway with his keys in his hand. "I'm learning to," he said. Diana nodded once. "Then that's the right answer." She went to get her suitcase. They drove back to Calloway Street and pulled into the driveway with minutes to spare before Sandra Hayes was due. Elijah was at the kitchen table with a glass of juice and the blank piece of paper from earlier. When the door opened and Diana walked in behind Randy, he looked up. He didn't make a sound. He reached for his pencil and began to draw. Sandra arrived at 10 o'clock with her clipboard and the same measured professionalism she'd carried the first time. She moved through the house again, kitchen, living room, Elijah's room. She looked at the shelf where Diana's books had returned to their place. She noted the tools Randy kept by the back door. She looked at the drawing on the kitchen wall, the three figures under a roof, still exactly where Elijah had put it the week before, undisturbed. Sandra sat at the kitchen table and asked Elijah how he liked living here. Elijah looked at her for a moment. Then he got up, went to his room, came back with the folded piece of paper from his desk drawer, and opened it flat on the table in front of her. Three figures under a roof. The tall one, the shorter one, and the woman near the door not leaving, just arrived. Sandra looked at it for a long time. She wrote something on her clipboard. Then she looked across the table at Randy. "I'll finalize the paperwork for legal guardianship this week," she said. After Sandra left, Randy stood at the kitchen window. Across the street, Carol was at her window as always, watching. The following afternoon, she appeared at the door with a covered plate, her posture carrying something different from her usual self-assurance, more careful, less certain she'd be well received. "I made too much," she said when Randy opened the door. It was the same sentence people always used, but her voice had lost its supervisory edge. She held the plate out with both hands, and there was something in the gesture that was as close to an apology as Carol knew how to come. Randy looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the door wider. "You want to come in? Coffee's on." Carol looked past him into the kitchen where Diana was at the table, helping Elijah with something. The two of them bent over a piece of paper together. She stood at the threshold and took in the ordinary, unremarkable fact of a family in a kitchen. "All right," she said. "Just for a few minutes." Elijah looked up when she came in. He met her eyes and gave her a single nod, brief, easy, the kind he gave to people he had decided were going to be fine. Carol sat down at the table. Nobody mentioned what she had reported to Sandra Hayes. Neither side needed it said aloud. Some things are understood without being named, and the understanding itself is enough. By July, the yard had become a different place. Randy had built a low bench along the south fence, the kind of project that had no urgency and no deadline, just something he'd wanted to do and done. Elijah had claimed the middle section of the back lawn as his territory and spent weekend mornings there, conducting what Randy could only describe as research small structures from sticks and stones, experiments, whose logic was known only to the boy, results recorded in his notebook with the focused privacy of a serious scientist. On Saturday mornings, Randy sat on the porch with his coffee. Diana sat beside him. That was the whole of it, two people on a porch watching a child run. And Randy had come to understand that more than he'd had before was not a small thing. It was in fact the only unit of measurement that had ever made real sense for a life like his. Elijah came running back to the porch, kite trailing, and stopped in front of them both. "Are you and Miss Diana married?" he asked. He was 6.5 now and had recently decided that things should be named correctly. Randy looked at Diana. Diana looked back at him with the expression she'd perfected over these months, the one that said she was not going to rescue him from this. "Not officially," Randy said. Elijah considered this. "But are you going to be?" Diana said, "soon." Elijah turned without ceremony and went back to his kite. The wind had picked up. He had work to do. Randy held his coffee and watched him go. There are families built from bloodline and paperwork and the accumulation of years. And then there are the ones assembled from wreckage, from people who arrived at the same place from different directions, each carrying the specific shape of what they'd lost, and who found without planning it that the missing pieces fit each other's gaps. Randy had come home from war not knowing how to be still. He learned by staying. Elijah had come home not knowing if home was something that would hold. He drew it into existence before anyone else believed it could be real. Diana had come not to rescue anyone. She came because she recognized something in the two of them, a door left open that she understood how to walk through. They were not a family because they'd been born to it. They were a family because they had all at some point when it would have been easier not to chosen to remain. And sometimes that is the whole story. Not the grand gesture, not the perfect words, just the quiet daily act of deciding I'm still here. I'm not leaving. This is where I belong. If this story stayed with you, if something in Randy or Elijah or Diana felt familiar, you're not alone. A lot of us have been taught one way or another that we shouldn't need too much, that wanting a place to belong is asking for too much, that it's safer to leave before we're left. But every now and then, someone draws you into their house before you've even found the door, and that changes everything. If you've ever been the person who stayed when it would have been easier to go, or if you're still waiting for someone to stay, for you drop a comment below. This community has a way of reminding each other that neither of those things makes you weak. It makes you human. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Hit subscribe and come back. There are more stories like this one, quiet ones. True ones, the kind that don't shout but stay with you long after you've moved on with your day. Take care of yourself. We'll see you in the next one.